Hey, hi, this is Bob Boross, and this is my Jazz and Tap Life. Welcome to my YouTube channel. We're going to do something a little bit different today. It's going to be a little bit more freeform and just talking and showing a few examples. Going to try to tackle a little bit of the very, very difficult question, which you get asked quite a bit, is what is jazz dance? Not easy to explain, not easy to understand all the different facets of it, and certainly not easy to explain in a very short amount of time. But I'm going to give you at least my ideas on it, and from there a couple of video examples, and then we have the comments, and certainly you can put your input in and start a discussion on this, okay? First thing I want to do is remind you this is a subscription channel, so if you like the videos, please subscribe. Please click the notifications bell so that you have regular updates on when we put new things onto the channel. Okay, we really need subscribers because that's what drives the sponsorship from YouTube. So please consider that. So the first thing, what is jazz dance? I've done some writing on that, and what I'm going to do is show you. This is my book. It is a proof copy, but this is available on Amazon.com. So these are all the writings that I have done on jazz dance over the years. So it's comments on jazz dance 1996 to 2014. And one article which I wrote, which is published in here, is called The Family of Jazz Dance. And I am going to read a little bit from that and then also go back to the videos from there. So what is jazz dance? Well, jazz dance originally is both from an African root and from European root. Those two cultures came together on the American continent. By the early 1900s is when jazz music started to develop from that confluence. And then people moving to that music became what is known as jazz dance. So when people say, where does jazz dance come from? You really need to say first from the African dance influence, and then also from sort of an appearance that came from a European style of movement. Those two aspects came together. But really, jazz dance in its original form, done by the people who created it in 1910s, 1920s into the 1930s, was something that was done in a social setting. In other words, it was not choreographed, it was not for a show in particular. Later it became that. But originally it was from people just dancing together. Music would be played at a club, at a gathering, and people moved. They moved the way they felt to that music. And the qualities of the music became visible in the way the movement of the body was. So that's really where the real influence, the real beginning and roots of jazz dance came from. From that style of movement, those aspects were taken and then brought into concert styles, into Broadway styles, into choreographed styles mixed with ballet dance, modern dance, etc., much later, 1940s, 50s, etc. So what I'm going to do now is bring you off of this full screen, and we're going to go into something on YouTube that I pulled up. Now, this is from a documentary created by Mura, Dehn. Okay, now she was a very interesting character. She actually was Russian, and in her travels in the 1930s was throughout Europe and heard jazz music, thought it was amazing, wanted to come to the United States, find out what was jazz music, and she came and became part of what was happening in terms of the very beginning of jazz dance movement of that 1930s and 40s period, and became someone who chronicled what those movements were and where this happened. So this is actually from a film that she put together. The film was from the 1950s, but these were dancers from that 1930s, 40s, and 50s era. So if we bring this up, we can really see exactly what these movements are, whether they were the Charleston, which is what this dance was, and other movement styles that went along with dancing to that type of music in a social setting. So as we can see here, people are dancing as they feel, not particularly choreographed for a stage, just to show what their feelings were and how they reacted to what the music was telling them to do. A lot of the movement qualities that came out of this style of dance is what was sampled by other people from other genres like ballet and modern, and that's what moved into Broadway and concert dance in many years after that. So I would encourage you, I'll put all these links in the comments below, to really check out these videos. Watch these in entirety. There's probably, I'd say, 15 to 20 minutes of videos like this from the Spirit Moves. And this will really give you an example of the roots of jazz dance. And look for the energy, the movement styles, and how people use this to show who they were, you know, what their stature was, what their abilities were, and how they were represented within their community. Okay, so we will move off of the Spirit Moves. All right, now I'm going to go back to my book from here. I'm actually going to read a little bit. So my philosophy about jazz dance, not only that's where jazz dance originally started, but there are different aspects of jazz dance that happen in the continuum of jazz dance. So since jazz dance is a shared creation of countless individual contributions, there can be no definitive answer to the question, what is jazz dance? Yes, the initial manifestation of jazz dance, which is what we just saw, was a recognizable product of a particular time and circumstance. But as time passed and circumstances changed, so did jazz dance change as it absorbed new realities. So my take on the puzzle of how to define it is to say that the family of jazz dance exceeds the original first creation and has taken shape in various configurations, however diluted, of that original jazz purity. To limit jazz dance to one particular thing would preclude the infinite possibilities of what jazz dance can become. So jazz has something where you put yourself into it. Jazz has something where it comes from improvisation. And you have a community where you're accepted. There's sort of a general idea of why we are all here while we're doing jazz dance, but then I get to be myself within that framework. So all those individual contributions are what will change jazz dance, what will add new things to it and will keep it alive as it moves into the future. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those aspects of how jazz dance has changed also. So I'm going to go back now to my page from here. Okay. Now, actually, the first thing we're going to do is this is something by the African-American choreographer Katherine Dunham. In 1940, she created a dance called Barrel House Blues. Now, this is not from that 1940s period. This is a recreation with Cleo Parker Robinson, and she has a company in the Denver area. And you will see how she took a lot of those movements that we would have seen in that last Spirit Moves video and turned these into a concert stage production. This was not well received by the dance critic establishment when she first performed it in 1940, but as you can see, she's taking that characteristic of people, what they were like, what they felt like, what they danced like, and turned it into something that could be a concert performance. So this is actually from Barrel House Blues by Katherine Dunham. Now, even though this is more theatricalized, it still was staying pretty true to that original formation that we saw before. Yes, this was made to be seen as a concert performance and not as a social occasion, but they were depicting a social occasion in terms of how these two dancers came together. So this is very close to that original formation of jazz dance. Now, if we move on from there, we can go into someone who is known as, has been called the father of jazz dance or the father of theatrical jazz dance, and that's Jack Cole. And that's an interesting thought. He was one of the originators of somebody who first put together something for a choreographed style of jazz movement. But his influences not only were the swing feeling of jazz dance, but it was also East Indian dance and also modern dance, as he studied with the Dehn company and was fluent in modern dance styles also. But he had a certain way of putting things together. And now this is actually in late 1930s, like 37, 38, he put together using authentic East Indian dance moves, but performing it to swing jazz music. And at that time, the critics and the newspapers called it Hindu swing. As you can see, this is a sort of an evocation of it, which was in the film Kismet from 1955. And you can see that the East Indian dance movements are being performed to more of a swing jazz beat, but it's really not drawing from that movement source that we saw earlier from the spirit moves. So this is somewhat of a version of jazz dance, but certainly not true to the root. So there's a little bit of the bounce feeling from the swing beat, but the movements themselves are not drawing from that original jazz dance root. And that was a contribution of Jack Cole. And we're going to move on a little bit more. Let's see. No, Jack Cole is going to be up here. Sing, sing, sing. But Jack Cole version, not Bob Fosse version. Here we go. Okay. So this is actually from a late 1950s television show by a singer, a man named Perry Como. And so this is Jack Cole and a group of dancers performing his version of Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. So it's a jazz swing style of music, but at the same time you can see that the movements that he's drawing from really aren't totally from that jazz root that we saw before, and there's even a port de bras, use of the arms, that still come from that East Indian dance movement. So this is from that performance on the Perry Como television show. And Jack Cole is the lead dancer in that circle. Bump it up a little bit. Right there. Now that's an East Indian arm port de bras. So again, this idea that we're saying that Jack Cole is the father of theatrical jazz dance is something that can be talked about. He certainly was one of the first people. He's someone who gained a lot of notoriety from it. But in terms of actually using the movement route of jazz dance, there could be some discussion on that. And that's something I would like to talk a little bit about in the future as to maybe somebody who is a little bit more, how you say, working in jazz dance, but working from the root of jazz dance and not from other aspects of it. Okay. So now, then, how do we look at jazz dance? How do we know what jazz dance is? Well, one of the ways we can look at it is not to say there is one exact thing. Of course, if we want to say authentic jazz dance, then we'll go back to the vernacular. But from that continuum, that aspect that moved afterward, what do we talk about? How do we talk about these things of jazz dance? And really the way what we need to do it is to talk about not an exact thing of jazz dance, but a movement characteristic of jazz dance. What are the actual characteristics that then can be seen in other creations of what jazz dance is? I'm going to reach to a couple of other sources on this that I've used. This is a book called Jazz Dance, The Story of American Vernacular Dance by Marshall and Gene Stearns. Now this is one of the Bibles of jazz dance. This came out in the late 1950s, so it's really from that time period and earlier. And it talks very strongly about the vernacular aspects of jazz dance and the social aspects of jazz dance, and not really about the performance, the Broadway, the film versions where you would see jazz dance being used. But within here, the Stearns really talk about qualities of movement that you see in jazz dance. Another very important book that we can use as a source is Digging the Africanist Presence in American Performance, Dance and Other Contexts by Brenda Dixon Gottschalk. And this is another book that will break down what are the movement characteristics that go into this style of dance. So if we want to pull from both of these in particular, we can come up with different types of movements that sort of characterize what jazz dance is. And then from there, we can look at different versions of jazz dance and say, how much are those characteristics within that dance? A great amount of them, a middle amount, a small amount, and then we can sort of judge, well, how much of a jazz dance will this be in relation to the purity of what that root was that we saw. So I am going to go off of this screen just for a second and back onto here, and we're going to find another dancer. And this is Ksenia Parkhatskaya. And actually, she's a Russian dancer, but has really worked in a very more of the root of jazz dance style. So as she's moving, I'm going to give some ideas about movement styles, and maybe you'll see some of those styles in terms of what she is doing from here. Okay, and I want to make this down as little as possible. Okay. All right, so in terms of movement characteristics of jazz dance, one is there would be a low grounded stance of the body. So there's the knees bent, the body bent slightly from the waist, and the body being closer to the floor, not upright as you might see in ballet. The knees are primarily bent, and it's much more natural in the way the movements. The legs are often in a parallel leg position and not held in a strongly turned out position. The movement often begins from the pelvis. All right, so there's a sharp initial impulse in the pelvis that releases out through the arms and the legs in a diminishing flow of energy. So there's a sharp pop from the hip area, which will then reflect out through the legs, out through the arms, out through the fingers, and diminish. This connection of sharp and smooth gives the body a decisive energy of attack that links to the next coming attack through a rolling wave of movement intent. Another aspect you can go to is body isolations come into play when the dancer either imitates accents in the music or creates a counter rhythm of sophisticated body hits and stretches. The accents can be felt in the shoulders, in the ribs, in the hips, in the head, arms, and knees. The entire body can be utilized to reflect rhythmic response. So now we have to go back to jazz and jazz music, the way that jazz movement goes with jazz music. The jazz music has a uniquely sophisticated use of rhythm, and a jazz dancer should in some way draw from this deep well. This is of prime importance when the music is danced, especially when danced to not jazz. Whether it takes shape in sly syncopations or the play of sharp and soft accents that gently slur the center of a straight beat, the jazz dancer should display a skill in internalizing qualities that are found in jazz rhythms and making those rhythmic qualities visible in the body, which is what we are seeing here. Then there's also the level of personal expression. Components can be improvisation or emotional connection. It can be improvised on the spot, or it can result from an emotional connection. More so than any other concert form of dance, jazz dance involves feeling and being the dance as opposed to a detached inhabitation. All right, so that's a wonderful example of those qualities by Ksenia Parkhatskaya. Okay, and we'll come back off of her video. All right, now jazz can be seen in other forms. Here we have Bob Fosse. Now Bob Fosse is somebody who has worked very strongly in jazz dance, drawing from the root, but making it theatrical. So you've probably seen this before, but this is his Sing, Sing, Sing. And this is from the original Fosse production in 1998. I would love to have the 1978 version, but the quality of those videos are not very good. Okay, so let's watch a little bit of this. And if we can see, does this at all reflect that root that we saw in the Spirit Moves in terms of what the body movement styles are? So again, this is a way of taking that original root and then using it in a much more contemporary format and making it come alive in a new way of expression. Okay, and other really strong examples might be District Storyville. Now this is Donald McHale, who is an amazing, amazing modern and jazz dance choreographer. And he created one piece in particular called District Storyville, which was about that area of New Orleans where jazz really started. You cannot find any video of this, but here is a photo, as you can see, that would be representative of when this was staged by, who was this for? It was a group in Oakland, I believe, that this was staged for in the 1980s when we see that photo from here. So that would be a strong example of using jazz dance. Other ways of jazz dance that we see now, this is from So You Think You Can Dance, and it's a little bit of a thing with me because sometimes it's called a jazz routine and there really isn't much jazz, or certainly not reflective of what the root of jazz is, and it can just give a different impression to people who don't know what the root is, and they hear the word jazz, and then they think, oh, that must be what jazz is, okay? So this is a little clip from a jazz routine. Now, in some ways, there's a similarity. There's the lower body, there's a slight crouch, there's the wobble in the legs, there's kind of a shuffling movement of the feet. But the rhythmic accent certainly is not there. That hit and the softness after, as it reflects out through the body, is not there. And people are definitely not dancing in a community sense. It's very much for the audience, to wow the audience, to get that certain response out of the audience. So, yeah, it reflects some of the roots of jazz dance, but it's not a really, really strong example of what jazz dance could be. And I want to go even one more into it. Now, this is from season 3, and this is from the Memoirs of the Geisha soundtrack. So again, a very non-jazzy music track that they're dancing to. The movements then become a little bit more lyrical, a little bit more ballet in terms of how they are moving their legs from the hips. But again, they're dancing jazz, and if somebody looks at this and says, oh, that's what jazz is, they're not going to be knowing what the real root of jazz is. Okay, I'm going to pull this back to me just for 1 second, and then we're going to go into our conclusion. But jazz dance can be used in many different ways, and many ways that are very relevant today. It doesn't have to look like it was in the 1920s, but the qualities can be used and bring that energy and vibrancy and that meaning and that expression and put it into today's way of thinking, and can be something that's very, very valuable and something that's very, very influential, right? That makes a big impact on your viewer. So I'm just going to leave you with one little thing from the ending of this article that I wrote for my book, and this is a little clip of choreography to the Joyce Spring. To restrict jazz dance label only to vernacular examples would be too limiting, as there are many fine examples of dance in later decades that draw from the defining jazz characteristics in strong enough doses to honor and make visible the roots of jazz dance. We pay our respects to the founders of jazz dance when we continue to use the remarkable inventions with reverence. I feel that a dance can be seen as jazz as long as the choreographer is knowledgeable of jazz dance history and its defining characteristics and utilizes those characteristics in a fashion that honors the jazz dance heritage. So that's my take on what is jazz dance. Whatever you might think, put it in the comments. Let's start a conversation on this. Please subscribe to the channel. You know, we need to have subscribers to receive that support from YouTube. That will make it a success. Subscribe to the channel, and also click the notifications bell so that when something new is uploaded, you'll get immediate notification from it. Okay? Thanks for stopping by. I know this has been a little bit of a long discussion, but jazz dance is certainly a very deep topic to discuss. This is really on the surface, but hopefully this will provide some information for a form of dance that is so amazing, but unfortunately is so misunderstood.